Hi everyone, we're back with another episode of Nazareth to Nicaea, the show where we keep you informed about all things about the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and whatever there is in between. This week, I'm talking to Dr. David Capes. He's the director of the Linear Theological Library, and David is a fantastic soul. He really is such a wonderful man. He's a great scholar. He's dedicated to the Church of Jesus, and he really is a wonderful chap that you everyone gets along with. But on the scholarly side, he's done some great works on Pauline Christology. I mean, he's been working on this area for, over a number of years. I think his most recent book is The Divine Christ, put out by Baker. Now, I know in early Christology, the big dominating names are people like, Larry Hurtado and Richard Bauckham and the like. But someone you really should know about is David Capes. And that's why I'm interviewing him in this episode on Philippians 2, 6 to 11. And you'll see that, David definitely knows his stuff. I mean, he's really been through this text for oh my gosh, for decades. He's got a wealth of learning. He's really worth listening to, and he's got great insights, particularly in the way that Old Testament Yahweh passages were applied to Jesus. So that's what I'm going to talk to David about in this episode. And in the next episode, in a few weeks, we're going to chat again, but next time it'll be about Colossians 1, 15 to 20. We're going to start a new series on that different text of Paul's letters, looking at this, allegedly traditional material in Paul's letters, but moving on from Philippians 2 and beginning to look at Colossians 1. So all that to come in this episode and the next one. Hope you enjoy it. We're rolling. Well, I'm here with my long-term friend, David Capes, down at Houston. Now, David, you've taught at several places around the United States. Well, first of all, you did your PhD at Edinburgh, didn't you? Edinburgh University.
Actually, I didn't, Mike. I did my
Oh,
PhD with Earl Ellis at Southwestern Seminary years and years
yes,
ago.
I should have known that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time at Edinburgh because I've done two sabbaticals there and have gotten friends there and have been there for a number of conferences and that kind of thing. But Southwestern Seminary, yeah, that was years ago when it was a very different kind of place.
Yeah. And so what was Earl Ellis like as a scholar? Because he was one of the a very technically proficient scholar who
Great.
wrote some very good technical works. I mean, I've still used some of his stuff on Luke. I go back to every now and then, and he's got that
Yeah.
Brill volume on the making of the New Testament, which is something of a summary of his work. He never finished his 1 Corinthians commentary for the ICC,
No,
although
he
I
never
hear.
did. He worked on that for about 20 years and never finished it up. And I know that was one of the things that bothered him. He passed away in 2010, 2011, somewhere in that range. A very proficient scholar. He was originally a Floridian. He grew up in Florida. And I think his dad, he served in World War II
Yeah, as a military
and
policeman. Yeah.
ended up doing a PhD at University of Edinburgh, which was my first exposure to it many years ago. So he loved it. He was really more European in his way of thinking about scholarship than he was an American in some ways. In fact, he was better known in Germany, where he had done a few postdocs and such, and in Britain than he was with the American scholars, world of American scholarship in New Testament, But he was an interesting guy. Now, let me just to sum it up. In 25 years at Southwestern Seminary, he had 5 people to finish with him
Ah,
as PhD. Only 5, and that's one every 5 years, right? So he was a bit tough to be. He was a bit tough to work with. He was not the most. He was not the most touchy feely guy, but he was very proficient, very exacting. He knew exactly what he wanted from his students, and which I've benefited from greatly. Not the best bedside manner, we might say, in being an academic, but very very competent in what he did and competent in languages, secondary materials, German sources, those kind of things. So
yeah.
I think I've inherited a little bit of that.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Well, that's interesting. So he was obviously one influence on you. What did you do your PhD thesis on at Southwest?
Well, I've sort of, I don't know if I've coined the phrase Yahweh text, but I did my PhD was on Paul's use of Old Testament Yahweh text and its implications for his Christology. So I was really fascinated by Paul's reading of the Old Testament and how Paul took those passages that reference the divine name, what I refer to as Yahweh text, and applied those to Jesus. Now, he didn't do it with every one. Some of those Yahweh texts were associated with God the Father, but some of them inevitably were referencing Jesus. And I think I made arguments, I made arguments to that effect on a number of those passages. When I came through many years ago, Michael, sorry, when I came through, Mike, a while back, the very first thing that people told me that was the word kurios referred to Jesus in the New Testament, except in Old Testament passages. And in all those, they referred to God the Father. Well, I wasn't satisfied with that and that's really where I began pressing the question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I'm glad you pressed it because your PhD was published and on this topic, if I remember, was it more Seebeck?
Yeah, More Seebeck was the first time, and it's been sort of redone in a couple of ways since then. But Divine Christ is the most recent version
Yep.
of that. So I
Okay.
revisited that, reprised that connection with those texts, and carried forth the argument just a little bit further. But I still think it's an appropriation of Old Testament text referring to the divine name as Jesus and Jesus in the divine name. And there's all sorts of really interesting Christological implications to that.
And that is, and indeed, those implications were worked out with a group of scholars, a kind of club called the Early High Christology Club.
Yeah,
Which, because
yeah,
I mean, you're doing this sort of work on Yahweh Text and Paul around the same time that Larry Hurtado is
mhm,
writing some of his first works on Christology. You've got his 1989 book, One Lord, One God.
yeah.
Richard
Wonderful
Balcom
book.
is increasingly writing on this topic as well, and
Yeah,
James Dunn had his view, and then you got Morris Casey floating around too, and so you've got these
sure.
people
Yeah,
saying how high was Christology and how early was it? Um,
yeah,
and
exactly.
this is the oral tradition I've heard. David, tell me if this is correct. That there was a
Okay.
bunch of
All right.
some conference in Edinburgh or Durham. You guys are all around dinner, and someone proposes a toast to early high Christology, and
Uh-huh.
James Dunn says, let's just make it high Christology, since he's not convinced it's necessarily early or before the Gospel of John. And then Morris
Yeah.
Casey just says, just to Christology, since he wasn't a particular
Yes.
fan of high Christology at all. Is my is
Yeah.
my oral tradition here correct? What
It's
I've heard?
close. It's close. It was at an SBL conference. We had just finished a session, final session of a steering group. In those days, the SBL leadership didn't like the word Christology, so they avoided it. So we had a group called the Divine Mediators in Antiquity group. So we stayed away from the word Christology. So we looked at the question of divine mediation. And we went through, you had about 8-year lifespan on these groups. And we had a wonderful run. It was our last year. And yeah, we were all seated around the table. I was there. Carrie Newman was the guy that raised the glass for the first time and said, to an early high Christology. And of course, I raised my cup and Larry raised his cup. And ironically, people don't know this about Alan Siegel, but Alan Siegel was there. Alan
Ah, yeah.
Siegel is a Jewish scholar of the New Testament who was at Columbia University. Now, Alan was not a convinced believer, but he was convinced as a historian that Paul operated with a very high Christology from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so he raised his cup as well. But Jimmy Dunn, no, he sat down at the other end of the table. I can tell you where everybody was sitting at the table. And Jimmy Dunn just he kind of twisted his glass around and he just said, to high Christology. And then Morris Casey was at the far end of the table. And he just sort of shook his head, but he finally lifted his cup and said, "To Christology." And we all said, "Here, here," and we applauded. It was a
Okay.
great moment. It really was. It really did happen. Yeah, exactly like that.
Okay,
But
it's
Gary
good.
Newman was the fellow that sort of incited it all.
Okay, well, I know I've even seen things like coffee mugs would say early high Christology club.
Yeah,
Ah, I mean, you
here
can
I
show
have
one
I
on the
have
camera.
one right
And
here.
that's
Yeah,
right. That probably because I've been in your office. Um,
you've been there before. Yeah, this is early high Christology club. These are our initial colors and everything, and we've inducted a number of people into our club a
yeah,
lot through the years. I think there's a fairly strong consensus these days that Christology is not something that's developed slowly over decades and centuries, obviously, but it's something and Martin Hengel made the case early on that it just took a few years for a high Christology to develop.
yeah,
And even in Bart Ehrman's book, how Jesus became God, he makes the case. He holds that it's a fairly quick turnaround. It's not something that took decades and decades, which was Jimmy Dunn's point of view. That it
yeah.
was, and we said sort of jokingly that he belonged to the late, low, and slow club. So if we were the early high Christology, he was at the late, low, and slow club.
Yeah, oh, fair
He's
enough.
the board of that group.
You
Yeah,
know, I think, well, in the case of Jimmy, I mean, he was saying, look, high Christology is the Gospel of John. Anything that's not the Gospel of
yeah,
John is not high Christology, which I thought
yeah,
was a pretty strange bar, since John is not the only show. I mean, I wouldn't just simply define John as the high Christology. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's another topic. But I mean, let's go back to your work on Yahweh text, because I mean, this is
Sure.
what
Yeah, yeah.
you've done that in your thesis. You revisited in a kind of a rehash of that book in the Divine Christ. Obviously, one text where you've spent a lot of time in is Philippians 2, 6 to 11. The Christ
Mhm.
hymn, the Christ poem, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Can you tell us what are the most significant aspects of this text for, let's call it, early high Christology?
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the first questions is whether or not you can look at this text and say, is there a sense that you have here, Mike, the pre-existence of Christ? Is that represented here? Because going together with an early high Christology is this notion that Jesus pre-existed in some sense, or the one that we call Jesus historically, Jesus of Nazareth, pre-existed. Now, whether you say you refer to him as the Son of God at that point, or some other title, uh, that's a big question. And our friend Andrew Perriman has written on that recently,
Yeah.
and came up with a very interesting kind of thesis in his book, In the Form of a God,
Yeah.
which is tells you a little bit about his perspective there. I find his work there very interesting. I'm not totally convinced. I
Yeah.
think
Me either.
he says a variety of things that I think I need to pay more attention to. But I think that's one of the first keys is the idea of the pre-existence of Jesus expressed here when it says that who in the form of God being, at the very beginning of it, he's existing, or he is in the form of God. And so that's a very initial question that talks about the initial sense of, is this a high Christology passage? I think it is. And I think it does speak to and represent an early high Christology, because I think the preexistence of Christ is represented there as well. And then there's the question, what does it mean that he did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped for or held on to? I mean, there's differences in
Mm.
that kind of thing. But the question of emptying himself, becoming a man, taking on the form of a man, those kind of things, I think speak of a kind of an early pre-incarnational kind of language that wasn't available to Paul and maybe to his churches, but it was the language of John, which comes later, is a different sort of language that speaks about incarnation. But I do think you have early kind of hints or whispers at incarnation in passages like this in Paul. So with incarnation goes the idea that the one who was God has taken on human form. And I think that's part of the character here. I don't think this is just Adam Christology on steroids or something, that really powerful stuff about Adam Christology. I see it as part of the background, maybe, and part of the texture, but not the whole thing. And Perriman's argument that this really represents a more Greek vision of the world, that there were plenty of gods appearing here and there and yonder in the ancient world. I don't discount that at all. I don't think that's what's informing this passage, because what would be odd to me is that the part one of the hymn would be, according to his telling, would be very Greek, and the second part would be very Jewish.
Yeah.
So because you're taking that passage that refers to the Yahweh in Isaiah 45 now, and you're wrapping that all around Jesus, and Jesus is the one who is declared as Lord there, and the one to whom every knee bows and every tongue confesses. So that's really where I spent a lot of my time, Mike, as I was looking at that particular second part of the passage, which is the part that people say doesn't really fit in. One of the reasons we know, or we think, that it's a hymn is that the very first part seems to fit into Paul's rhetoric in the early part of chapter 2 about, don't consider yourself that important, or don't seek your own identity first, but look to the other person and take care of the other. That's very much reflected in the first part. But when you come to the second part, that doesn't fit in so well with it. It says that God highly exalted or super exalted him and gave him this name that is above every name. And I began thinking, what name is that referred to? And we have this in America, and I think other people do as well, this piety around the name Jesus. We sing songs like "Jesus is the sweetest name I know," and great hymns of the faith, of the pietistic faith. And so a lot of people read that. What does it mean that the name that is above every name? Well, that's the name Jesus. Well, probably not. The name that is granted to Jesus, that is bestowed upon Jesus, most likely is the reference to the divine name, the unspeakable name of God, the ineffable name of God. So that at the name of Jesus, when the name of Jesus is spoken, and that name is not Jesus, but the name is the name that belongs to Jesus. So I take that in verse 10 as a genitive of possession, rather than a genitive that is sometimes referred to as an exegetical genitive, which means at the name that is Jesus, no, the name that belongs to Jesus. So that becomes very important part of my own sort of faith journey, and on a part of my understanding of that particular text. And that language of every knee bowing and every tongue confessing, of heavenly, earthly, and subterranean things, is taken right out of the most stridently monotheistic passage in all of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 45. When you read it, you see it, this refrain: I am Yahweh and there is no other. I am Yahweh and there is no other. And every knee will bow to me and every tongue will confess to me. So when that language now is taken and applied to Jesus, I think that's a remarkable appropriation of biblical text. If it's not true, then it's heretical.
Yeah, I think that's true. If it's, it would be a violation or a conflation or an ultimate, two powers heresy in rabbinic language, if you conflated a purely human figure with the most high God of creation and covenant. I think that would definitely be the case. Can I ask? I think that's great. I hadn't thought for a long time about the nature of the genitive, whether it's possessive or epexegetical. What do you say? What do you say to someone who says, "Look, it's a big deal, but it's not that big a deal." If you read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, Melchizedek, whether it's a person or an angel, is called Elohim. I mean, they're applying the language of Psalm 82. So applying God language to a mere human figure, I mean, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it's not like other people aren't doing it.
Right. Well, I do think what Paul is up to, and I do think what the New Testament is up to, is quite a different species. The name Melchizedek, they're referring, I'm trying to remember exact passage, 4Q, one of the four
Yeah,
Qs.
11Q milk, I think.
Is it 11Q? Okay.
11Q
Uh,
milk.
I'd have to go back and look exactly at the text, but I think there are good reasons to suggest that what Paul is doing and what he's doing consistently and programmatically is distinct from what you see with various figures around, whether it's the teacher of righteousness or Melchizedek or some other figure. Yeah, God has agents, and these agents are to some degree identified with God in appropriate ways from a Jewish perspective. But the application of the name of God, the special name of God to a figure like Jesus, a single figure, not multiple figures. Because what you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls is you've got teacher of righteousness, you've got Melchizedek, and I think there's one or two other characters in that group that are referred to using these kinds of things, but never with the divine name. So I think programmatically, there's a difference between what Paul is doing, what the Dead Sea Scrolls are doing. I know I've written about this somewhere. You know, I go
That's why I
somewhere I
asked.
said something right about this. So, but I do think that what Paul is doing is very different than what you see that's occasional and over a periods of hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
But I think it is a big deal. I think it's remarkable what happens there, and it is unique. It is unique. It's not the same species as the species of what we see happening in Paul's letters and language, and the rest of the New Testament. Because I just finished a book on Matthew called Matthew Through Old Testament Eyes, and I saw the same phenomenon in Matthew, and even the pressing of prayer language over toward Jesus that I thought was, wow, this is the language of prayer of the Psalms now being expressed directly to the Son of Man or to the Son of David, and you often using the term Lord there as well. So, Lord, save us now, those kinds of things as well. So you see that. So it's not unique to Paul. I think early Christians are doing this. I do think that they have become convinced that Jesus is more than just a man, that he is identified with God in a remarkable way, maybe even as the manifestation of Yahweh himself. I use that language of manifestation because I think it's words like hypostasis sometimes get lost in the.
Yeah, well, that becomes a big. I mean, the meaning of that word is debated heavily in the 4th century and
Right.
thereafter. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, it is interesting that other figures, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, other Jewish literature, can be called God or God-like, but in 11Q, Melchizedek seems to be the divine counterpart to Belial, or the devil. So he's like the divine answer to the devil. He's not really identified with Israel's God, so he's divine, but he's a divine counterpart to another supernatural creature. Whereas I think in Philippians 2, it's bringing that the identification between Israel's Lord and Jesus, that gap is lessened. So I mean that's why I'm sympathetic to your I think your way of saying it's a slightly different species. Again, there's similarities and differences going on, but I think there is something a little bit more intense about how the connection is made between Jesus and the kurios of Israel's faith, law, history, and tradition. So
good. Yeah, no, I think your more recent book that we've talked about before has done a great job sort of identifying the difference between kind of the functional, just saying it's functional. These figures are agents of God functioning and doing divine agency kinds of things, which is where Larry Hurtado began his discovery back in the 1980s, I think, with his first book, One God, One Lord. And then moving kind of beyond that to, this is more ontological in nature than it is just people functioning, doing things on behalf of God or doing things in God's name kind of thing that are consistent with the God of Israel. Yeah. So, scholars like Richard Bauckham have come out with ways of trying to describe this relationship. And the idea of being included within the divine identity. That's kind of his catchphrase, I think, for it. That they're not two gods at all, but that Jesus is now included within the divine identity, and that's how we're to see him. And divine identity becomes very important for him. Richard Hayes has talked about Jesus being the embodiment of the God of Israel, which is a way of saying incarnation, right? And N.T. Wright as well as others. I think Wright talks about that the beginning, the idea of Yahweh returning to Zion is the beginning of Christology.
Yeah.
And so that could be just theology, but Yahweh coming to Zion and identifying that with Jesus, that becomes deeply and I think satisfyingly Christological.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I should also say that book of mine, Jesus Among the Gods, is dedicated to you, David. So you get
you were so kind. I was surprised to see that. I really was. I was very appreciative of that.
Well, no, it was my pleasure. You're a great scholar of Christology. I mean, I was reading your works, many, many years ago. Don't want to make you feel old, but a long time ago, I
am. Yeah.
I was reading your
I
works.
should be retired by now. So.
And I've gotten to know you in your work in various places that you've taught, more recently at the Linear Library. So that's great. Well, anyway, that's great. Thank you for sharing with us on Philippians 2, 6-11. Next time, I'll be talking to David again, but this time on Colossians 1, 15-20. If the Christ hymn is the crown prince of the family of Pauline Christology texts, I think Colossians 1:15 is the Prince Harry of the family. Neglected, abused, feeling genuinely second class. It's all about William and Harry. William's the crown prince. Everyone loves Philippians 2, but no one really thinks anything of Colossians 1:15-20. I mean, Philippians 2 gets all the airtime, but that's what we'll do next time.
That sounds great. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thanks everyone for watching. Well, that concludes the episode of Nazareth to Nicaea. Hope you really enjoyed it. If you like, leave a comment, leave a question. If you're enjoying the material you're hearing, then share it with your friends wherever they are. If you're listening it on the podcast vision, hey, please leave us a review. It'll help get the word out about the program and spread this show as it tries to educate, edify, and just get people interested and excited about studying early Christology. I'm Mike Bird, and thanks for listening.